Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out this evening. Thank you for joining us on Zoom for our second Conversation with Collectors, a series organized as part of the Phillips Collection centennial celebration. I'm Dorothy Kaczynski. I'm the Vredenburg Director and CEO of the Phillips Collection. And you hear storm in the outdoors. So I'm glad that those of you with us in the historic music room are dry and warm and comfortable. And I hope that's true for all of you who are joining us in Zoom. Just a comment about the notion of this series. We felt it was really important to shine the light on the role of the private collector, which is so vital for the growth of the collections of many American museums. Historically at the Phillips, of course, this is like a vital foundational element of how and why we exist, Duncan and Marjorie Phillips, of course, and then subsequently their family. But even during my tenure at the Phillips, we have received many important gifts of works of art or promised gifts that will come to the Phillips in the fullness of time. I'm thinking of the enormously important collection of Nabi, late 19th century Nabi works, a promised gift from the late Vicky Sant and her husband Roger. I'm thinking of a gift that was already executed from the collector and gallerist Michael Werner of about 50 German or Northern European contemporary works, works from the Alfonso Osorio Foundation, works from the Karl Appel Foundation. And in each of those cases, we're talking about 15, 20, 50 works in each of those cases. We're talking about a spectacularly important and focused growth. Plus, there are many individual, very important works of art that have been gifted to us or are promise gifts from many of our trustees, our patrons, our supporters. So I just think that it's important to highlight that dialogue. It's really the lifeblood of the growth of important museum collections. And also to think about the contribution of the passionate collector with his or her focus on the artist. That was certainly the story of Duncan Phillips. Above all, he wanted to support artists and to give them the kind of platform that they needed to succeed in their careers. Our first conversation was focused on Rosalind Jacobs and her husband and their love affair with the surrealist artist Man Ray and his group of friends and their wives and neighbors, and her passionate collecting of surrealism evolved out of those friendships. So that idea of motivations, of passion, of the focus of time and thought and treasure on supporting artists. So that's just as a little bit of a background on why we launched into this. So this will be our second conversation, and I believe we have 2 more scheduled for the fall, and we'll focus on collectors of African American art, and is very timely considering we will be focusing on 2 great masters of the African American artistic tradition, the works of David Driscoll and of Alma Thomas. So tonight we're very pleased to host Harvey Ross, who will be in conversation with Phillips Senior Curator Elsa Smithgall. In their conversation, you'll hear about Harvey's journey as a collector, how he and his late wife, Harvey-Ann, had a passion for the art of William Gropper and socially conscious art, that led them subsequently to discover Jacob Lawrence's Struggle series. Harvey has served as a steadfast champion of Lawrence's Struggle series, making it his mission to acquire no less than 15, that's about half of the original 30-panel series that for 60 years has lived among numerous public and private collections. His foresight, generosity of spirit, and leadership have made a lasting contribution to furthering the scholarship and critical examination of a yet unstudied body of Lawrence's work. Indeed, the reunion of the Struggle series celebrated in our current special exhibition would not have been possible without him. Harvey has also shared his astute vision and knowledge about art with the Phillips through his dedicated service as a member of the museum's Board of Trustees. We are delighted to have this opportunity tonight for Harvey to share his personal insights into his collection and how it has been thoughtfully shaped by a strong belief in the potential of art to inspire, educate, and question aspects of our shared history. So a bit of housekeeping that my astute staff has reminded me of before we start. Following the conversation, we will have a Q&A portion here in the room, and also we'll take questions from our audience on Zoom. If you are joining us online, you can put your comments and questions in the chat, and we will harvest them and bring them forward in that Q&A section of the webinar. So now I turn it over to Senior Curator Elsa Smithgall and our distinguished Harvey Ross.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Harvey, for being with us. This is just such a pleasure to have the chance to have the conversation with you and for all our audiences to enjoy. And I think that it'll be a lovely occasion, and I'm looking forward to learning something new. Always learn something new from you. So
it's a pleasure to be here. I feel we are like those athletes in Tokyo last week who had prepared for many years. And here we are with a wonderful, intimate group of theoretically 26 people, and whoever else is up high or in Zoom. But I'm looking forward to this conversation, given all the hurdles we had to surmount.
Absolutely. Well, I thought it would be a really great starting point to give people a sense of your collection before we even get to Lawrence, because there's a whole nother chapter to look at on the screen you're seeing. Your picture in front of this incredible painting by William Gropper of the Paul Bunyan that he paints in 1945. It's an incredible work, and of course, Gropper is someone that you have quite an extensive collection of. But just to kind of give people an idea of how did you come upon his work and your interest in collecting?
Sure. Well, when I was young, my parents said there was an important artist in the family, and important to me meant important in the family. Much later on, around 1991. I discovered that William Gropper was important way beyond the family. He was one of the leading social realist artists of the 1930s and 40s in this country. And so I started with my wife to look at a lot of literature that has been written about him, extensive literature, in part as a quest, as a search to understand something about my roots. It gets better. As I went through the literature, I came to realize that he was not only an important artist, but more importantly, he stood for things that distinguished him as a human being. He was not afraid to speak truth to power, including at times when it was dangerous to do so. He always fought for civil rights, civil liberties, the dignity of labor, the immigrant experience in America was important to him, anti-fascism, all of the things that were part of his entire life's output. And so in the early 90s, my wife and I started collecting his works, many drawings and some paintings. Over time, we started to look at the literature about contemporaries, others who might have shared his vision. And I came across a book in maybe 1992, 93 by David Shapiro called Social Realism, Art as Weapon. And this book talked about the whole movement of social realism, the historical aspects of it, artistic elements. And it also highlighted 5 or 6 of the leading social realist artists of that period, the 30s and the 40s. Gropper was one of them, Ben Shorn was another, Philip Evergood was a third, Jacob Lawrence. Now, I looked at Jacob Lawrence's bio and realized that he was a little different from the other 3. Generally, the social realists tended to be Jewish, mostly born in the 1890s. Jacob Lawrence was a generation behind. He was born in 1917. He was African American, but he was looking at the same kinds of issues as these other artists through his own personal lens, and that was the lens of an African American growing up in the early, mid-20th century. And around 1995, the Phillips and MoMA decided to have a reenactment, the 60 panels of the Migration Series. 30 are here at the Phillips, the other 30 are at MoMA. They don't often get together, but in January of 1995, they did get together. My wife and I saw it, and we were very moved by the narrative, by the art. And at the same time, just a few blocks away in Manhattan, there was another exhibition at Midtown Payson Gallery of a Lawrence series, and we wanted to go to see that as well. We did. There were about 16 panels that were being shown. They corresponded to the themes that were already a part of our collection, having started to collect Gropper: struggle, civil rights, civil liberties, and so on. And the other thing that was particularly interesting to us was that, unlike any of Lawrence's other series, many of these paintings were in private hands. It was a partial 16 out of the 30 series on the walls there of the struggles. That was our introduction to it. And we thought maybe within some period of time we might get 1 or 2 of these paintings for the collection. Within a year or so we did get a couple of them. A couple of years later we got a third. And over time we continued to accumulate them, but with no idea that we were in the process of reconstructing the series. It's now been 26 years since we first started to collect this particular series. I'm happy to tell you more about how it got together later, but that gives you some flavor for how Gropper led to Lawrence and some of the other artists that we might be talking about tonight.
Well, Harvey, I put the America, its folklore map in context with your painting of Paul Bunyan and the detail you see below there of the lumberjack himself. This was the map from the subsequent year that Gropper had made. And to your point about him being willing to confront hard truths, but also injustice, tell us a bit about how this chapter unfolds in terms of the connection with his own life story.
Sure. Well, there are any number of things in common, even with Paul Bunyan. I'm 6 feet, he's 14 feet. He's a little bit bigger. This painting was painted in 1945. I was born in 1945, so we have that connection. But this is not only a folklore image that Gropper created in 1945, is part of a series of folklore images that he created and then put into this folklore map that the State Department sponsored and bought 1,700 copies of and distributed throughout the world in the various overseas libraries at the State Department. And when I look at this painting, it's not only a beautiful painting to me, but it's about the spirit of America, small people, individuals, different nationalities and backgrounds coming together to create great things, to tower over mountains, to build dams, and so on and so forth. But it goes way beyond that when I look at it in my house and think about it, because the folklore map that was put together in 1946 for the State Department was also sold throughout the country to individuals and schools, thousands of copies. But in 1953, Joseph McCarthy's counsel, Roy Cohn, and his buddy David Shine, went to Europe as part of the Senate subcommittee on investigation that McCarthy was running to look in foreign libraries to see if there was subversive material there, mostly by authors. But in coming into the libraries, he discovered this particular map. And McCarthy's view was that there were many subversive people in government, and he was concerned about others who might not be in government but had some relationship to it. The relationship, the hook, was that 1,700 maps had been purchased by the State Department. So Gropper was called in May of 1953 to appear before the subcommittee. There were about 650 people who appeared before the subcommittee over the course of many years. Thousands of lives were destroyed. He was one of only two artists who had the misfortune to appear. The other was Rockwell Kent. Rockwell Kent was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. Gropper was deeply sympathetic to socialist and communist ideals, but he was never a card-carrying member. Nonetheless, when he appeared before Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn, he refused to cooperate. He refused to name names. He took the Fifth Amendment and was blacklisted for the next 8 years. So when I look at this painting, it's more than just about a folklore series. It's about the man's strength in challenging injustices of that witch hunt. And it's just wonderful to see every day. Along with a map, I happen to have bought a map. They're kind of scarce because there were thousands of them at one time, but after he got blacklisted, many schools and individuals destroyed those maps. So it's a rare item. It costs maybe $2,000 to get a good copy of a simple map that cost $10 at the time.
Well, I think that leads nicely, that part of his history with McCarthyism, to the next, the next slide here, where I'm showing just 2 of the 50 lithographs from this series that he does, Capriccios, inspired by Goya, but also very much a series that comes after this incident, and in a way kind of channels the outrage and injustice that he himself suffered into this incredible body of work, of which you do own the complete series. So I know that I'm showing on the left justice, and of course the right, for obvious reasons that we've just said, is called Blacklist, but I think you've had some interesting ways that you thought of the work justice too, in light of this moment in the 50s.
Well, most of these artists that we have been collecting over the years overlap in many ways. So this series was from 1953 to 57. The Struggle series was from 1954 to 56. Lawrence and Gropper were friends. They had the same basic outlook. And what you see on the left is justice, and it's really McCarthy and the whole legal system and the police with this shackled person that could easily be Gropper or many others, who were subjected to the treatment that they were at that time. And I can tell you that unlike what's happened in recent years, when people have been pushed by an administration and millions of people respond, in those days when you were on the blacklist, people didn't know you. His works were, he could not show his works in New York or other places. The blacklist was a serious thing. They were tapping his phone, so on and so forth. He could not get mortgages. So instead of shrinking under that pressure, he took his creative energy and his anger and channeled it into a creative exercise. The 50 panels are a wonderful lithography. He didn't do that much lithography other than illustrating books. But this is an amazing artistic creation. I think it's just full of emotion and energy. These two and many of the other panels are absolutely first rate.
Well, I think with that in mind, the idea of justice or injustice, the paradox of the Declaration of Independence, we're going to now kind of look at another work from your collection that predates the ones we were looking at. So we're now looking at the 30s, right? We're looking at this incredible work. So tell us a bit about how you came upon this. And I actually thought, for the sake of the audience too, you can see the letters that are being overlaid on top of the Declaration of Independence. Maybe you would like to read that out, or as part of your commentary, share a bit about how he's reimagining this version.
This is all about his view and Jacob Lawrence's view in the Struggle series. We all grew up with certain myths and narratives, and I love this country. I hope it continues to improve. But Gropper was a critic, and even though he saw wonderful things about this country, he also saw major injustices and inadequacies. And so this particular drawing from 1938 talks about all men, women created equal, except for Negroes, Jews, immigrants, women, you name it. It's the same story 17 years later when Jacob Lawrence had a struggle series which focuses on women, African Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants. All four, they conflate. But this was a part of what, a very important part of what William Gropper was all about. And again, it merges the two artists in terms of their outlook and what they truly believe. You'll find that the difference is that Gropper published a lot of these cartoons or images, and it's in your face. There's no question of what he has in mind here. With Lawrence, it's much more subtle, and I think we'll get into that given the narrative that exists that is not patently obvious on the surface.
Well, I think we have a few more Gropper. In addition to his work as a painter and his works on the caricatures that we saw, there's also this side of him as a muralist. I think that we thought we would introduce by way of the work you own, which is the one on the far right of the screen here, the ink on paper. That's called Hunger March, but I'm showing it here thanks to Harvey giving us the image of the fact that it's really part of this larger triptych. That was a study done for an important exhibition MoMA holds in 1932, and that in and of itself is a fascinating story. So how did you come upon this image by Gropper? And how did you decide that this was something you needed to have?
Well, I came across this image randomly. I had seen in the literature that this triptych existed, and in 1932, when the new MoMA building was opened, the first artistic exhibition, I think they might have had an architectural one before, was a series by contemporary American artists who were invited by the museum, leading contemporary artists like Ben Shorn with his Sacco and Vanzetti series came from this particular moment, and Gropper and others did triptychs. This is the only part of the triptych I've ever found, but you can see the other two, and this is 1932. As soon as the trustees of MoMA, various people, whether it's the Rockefeller family and others, saw it, it became, people were concerned about it because, among others, if you look, you'll see J.P. Morgan there, drinking and carousing and so on and so forth. This is a year before Diego Rivera's mural at Rockefeller Center. Nelson Rockefeller was involved with both. He was 23 or 4 years old, but he was very active in the Museum of Modern Art. And of course, Rockefeller Center was in the process of being built at that time. So there was a painting that was created from the centerpiece there, which no longer exists. It's never been found, just like what happened to Diego Rivera's mural. So this was a year before what happened in Rockefeller Center with Diego Rivera. It's also 32 years before the 1964 World's Fair in New York, where Andy Warhol had paintings of 10 or 12 most wanted. That was there for a short period of time, and then Robert Moses, who was involved with the World's Fair, and Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of the state of New York at that time, decided that they had to expunge Warhol's series. So this has tremendous historic resonance, but the other two panels have never been found. The main painting has never been found. There are some images of it. And if you look closely, you'll see it's down with police terror, against lynching. You can see on the right-hand side, the tree, there are two ropes that are hanging down. Those, it's a lynching platform. It's so resonant of what has gone on in more recent times, and he really understood the challenges that America had and was concerned about moving things in the right direction.
Well, we threw in this next example of another mural by Gropper, not because it's in Harvey's collection, but because it's in our backyard here in Washington at the Department of the Interior. And so We just thought, again, because a lot of times we don't realize what we have here to enjoy on a future occasion, that we would share another example. But also, there's something about this that's pretty radical that I learned via Harvey that I'd let him tell you a little bit about.
Well, this mural is a centerpiece of the so-called New Department of the Interior, which was built in about 1938. As part of the New Deal, 1% of the construction costs of the building, which is one of the centerpieces of the New Deal, cost $10 million. $100,000, 1%, went to art. Gropper got $5,000 to paint this. It's the same year in 1937 when he got a Guggenheim Fellowship. So between the $5,000 he got and $2,500 from the Guggenheim Fellowship, he was able to go across the country in 1937, which was a very critical year, to see what was going on in the West. This is about land reclamation and dam building. And so he spent the whole summer, quite some time, touring the country. He had won this commission in a competitive contest. It's one of his 4 or 5 greatest murals. There are others, one in Detroit, one in Freeport, Long Island, and so on. But this is a marvelous painting. But he also decided to put social content to it. If you look closely in the middle, there's a African-American worker working side by side with whites. It was not allowed on those projects at that time. He chose to put it in. There was a big controversy at the time. They wanted him to get it out. He refused. It's there today, 83 years later. But it's a statement about who he was and what he felt, his vision for America.
All right, well, we'll have to check that out. Do a little field trip once things clear up in
I'm happy to
terms
join you. I've been there a few times. It's great.
So we're going to turn now to looking at these 2 works, this one and one next, by Philip Evergood, because he's another socially conscious artist, very active in the 1930s. And I know it took you a while to decide on the first acquisition. This is the first of the 2, called Railroad Men. So tell us a bit about what drew you to this. How did you end up deciding this was the one?
Well, as soon as I saw it, I knew it was the one, but my wife, who used to walk ahead of me in all these places I went, whether it was art galleries or, in this case, at the Armory in New York, she said, "You got to see this painting." So I went over and I saw the painting. Yeah, this is great. And I spoke to the dealer about it. He said it had just come in. And I said, let's make a deal, and we did. Because I've been looking for at least 15 years to find a good Evergood. Evergood has extraordinarily good works and a lot of weird, macabre type of works, very uneven. This is masterful. He was one of the first artists in the PWAP, which was established before the WPA's artist program. That was for established artists in late 1933 to June of 1934. And you can see Evergood himself painting a picture within a picture, a painting within a painting in the lower right-hand corner with this PWAP armband on. And I've looked at the literature, and he said that this is the painting that made him a social realist artist. He'd been painting for a long time. He was 32 or 33 years old, but he didn't necessarily focus on this aspect in his oeuvre. And it's just a marvelous painting. He said that he had gone to a Hooverville type of place, a railroad yard in Lower Manhattan in 1933, and saw these guys working from midnight until 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, and he was painting the whole scene. And he said just seeing what they went through became a part of him, and he kept that feeling for the rest of his life. But this painting was very important to him personally.
Well, also important to him personally is this incredibly seminal work, one of the ones he's very famous for, The American Tragedy, that he does 5 years later. So I'm sure when you saw this come up, this was one you knew you had to have. Tell us about what it's like to live with this painting. Where is it in your home? And tell us a bit more about what happened for you to be the fortunate one to find it.
Well, over the years, some dealers have discovered that I'm a serious collector. I'm not buying things to sell. I'm not putting it on the walls to impress. They see what I'm doing in terms of the core features within the collection. It's philosophical, it's thematic. And some years ago, a dealer who I'm pretty close to called me and said, how would you like to have the best Evergood in existence? I said, well, I'd love to have American Tragedy, but I couldn't afford it. He said, we'll work it out. And he did. But I got the first call. And the reason I got the first call is that he knew I was serious. He also asked if I might lend it from time to time, because this painting had been in another family's collection for 60 years and had only been shown 3 times during those 60 years, the last time being Barbara Haskell's 20th Century exhibition in Whitney in New York. So there you have it. But this is a personal thing for Evergood as well, because this massacre in East Chicago took place on Memorial Day 1937. There were strikers at the Inland Steel Factory, and there were picnickers just a half a mile away who decided to walk over to see what was going on, to be supportive of the strikers. And it was in the middle of a very tense year and very tense strike. And the police, their photographs and their motion pictures of what happened, much worse than what happened in 1968 in Chicago. And 10 people died, and about 100 people were badly injured. Many got shot in the back and so on. They were unarmed. You can see the narrative here. There's an African American down there, because the CIO, which was the organizing unit of the union, was an integrated union, unlike the AFL in those days. And you could see the intense imbalance between the peaceful marches of people who wanted to just be there in support, and the billy clubs and the pistols and so on that led to this terrible outrage. But the thing that was really so evocative for Evergood was that he was the head of the WPA's easel program in New York, and they'd had an event in about 6 months before this in New York, where the police eventually arrested him and others, and they, in the process of being jailed, he got beaten up pretty badly. So a few months later, when this happened, he knew he just had to express his feelings about what it had to feel like to be in that. And again, I'm a recent person with 30 years of involvement in art, but I can tell you that when I was a kid, I saw this image. So I know when I had the opportunity to put it in the collection, I was really very pleased.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, we're going to talk a bit about another artist that I know is one you equally admire, but just to give people a sense of the breadth of the collection and really the common ground, really, I would say. So when we look at this is the George Grosz. It's an illustration from this famous book by Upton Sinclair, 100% The American Patriot. And I think that you have the book as well with the illustrations. It was a hard thing to come by, right? But I'm showing you the German edition. It was obviously translated in German after the English edition. But tell us a bit about how I think your interest in Grosz might have been before Evergood. We might not be actually in the same sequence, which doesn't...
I knew more about Grosz in the 1980s than I knew about William Gropper, because I think he's one of the great artists of the 20th century. He has such a fine line. This book was published in 1920, which is a seminal year for what's going on here. In 1920, you had Sacco and Vanzetti, the robbery in Braintree. You had the Wall Street explosion that killed a lot of people. You had the Palmer raids around that time. There was the end of the war, there was fear of communism, and so on. And this is a book about the exploitation of workers by the capitalists. You see capitalist money bags at his feet, waving an American flag, with innocent people being brutalized, with the police helping out and the other authorities. But what you see on the person who's being hanged is the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And it just happened at that time, William Gropper was the official artist of the IWW. Gropper and Grosz did not know each other at that time. They met each other and became friends in 1932-33 when Grosz was fortunate to be able to escape Germany. But here's a connection between the two artists before they even knew one another, given the fact that this particular drawing and Gropper coincided chronologically. It's a special drawing. It had been brought from Germany by Grosz when he first came here, and Eric Cohn, who was one of his sponsors, had it in his collection, and Jack Levine, the artist, saw this in his collection maybe in the 1950s and agreed to paint something in return for owning this drawing. And then in the early 1990s, I was fortunate to see it, knew the importance, understood the connection between Gropper, IWW, and Grosz, and I'm thrilled to have that in the collection.
Well, you mentioned also what was going on in the 20s with the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. So you also have this in your collection, this really incisive image with the Statue of Liberty and the electric chair. So another one, but just to show these other artists before we get to the lead up here to return back to Gropper with Jacob Lawrence. So you were talking about the interesting parallels already between the time frame that Gropper does the Capriccios. So I just thought as a good segue, we could bring this back as we're going to start to think about how, as you said, it was sort of natural that you almost find your way to Jacob Lawrence, and particularly to the Struggle series, I would say.
Right. I think you're right in the sense that understanding something about Gropper, I can understand better something about some of these other artists, even though I might not know or have known as much about them at the time. I just know that they were on the same wavelength, and so am I.
So, I mean, I think that as you've talked a little bit at the outset about the moment that you make your first encounter with the struggle in that 1995 Midtown Payson show, which was at the same time that the reunion of the Migration series took place. So let's look at a few panels. Now we're going to look at a few panels from your collection of the struggle. As Dorothy said, we won't touch on all of them probably given time, but you own 15 of them at this point. And have really spent quite a few years studying them. So I feel like it's a really interesting moment to sort of reflect on this one, which does set the stage for the whole series, even though he doesn't paint it first in sequence, which is also interesting. But the way that this encapsulates perhaps an idea that you see carrying through Lawrence's work, and an idea that you've come to after really taking a lot of years, 25 some years, right, studying Lawrence. So what are your thoughts about this and at this time?
My thought is that this panel typifies many of the panels in the Struggle series. He was involved with what I would call subversive irony. On the surface, you look at this painting, we all know about Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. It's about subservience to the crown and the desire to break free. But the subversive irony that was not obvious to people who were looking at this in the 50s, and most of the critics were pretty dismissive of this series at that time, is that all of the panels have a caption or a text that accompanies them. And instead of saying, give me liberty or give me death, he took another section from the speech. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? And so, on the one hand, people will say, well, this is all about the revolution and America breaking free. But Patrick Henry was a slaveholder who was both tone deaf and colorblind to the fact that he viewed his slaves as mere chattel. And it took 90 years from that speech to the Emancipation Proclamation, and another 90 years from the Emancipation to that painting being created. And so I think a literal interpretation of this painting and some of the others. The critics looking at it 60-something years ago say, what's Jacob Lawrence doing with American history? Why doesn't he stick to African-American black history? But they didn't get it. And that's an example, a very important example, but not a unique example in this series, because the series is all about that. A completely different conception of American history, because he was going beneath the surface of what was common knowledge or myth to his own personal experience, which was very different from what we all imagined the American experience to be.
So I think that, as you said, that underlying subversiveness is not something that is unique to panel one, but it's interesting that it becomes the first one to set the stage for what follows. And really, going back to the idea that these panels really beg for for looking very deeply and very closely. So I think the fact that you've gotten to live with them and really spend a lot of time has opened up a lot of wonderful insights that we're all also still coming to. So I think that this one, panel 3, and to that point of we're still learning, is that there's still panels that are missing to this day, and there are panels that have surfaced over the time that you were you and your late wife were able to acquire, including this one, panel 3, which was without even an image when it was published in the Jacob Lawrence Caligrezone. So there was not a lot to go on, but it did surface. So I thought, and it turned out to be an incredible one. And so tell us a bit about how this one came across your
Well, as I mentioned,
collection.
my wife was a real partner on this and many other things. And in 2008, I'd say it was November 2008, I was at Christie's, and there was a panel. Again, I didn't get to it. She was way ahead of me. Said, you got to see this panel. I went to see it. I said, geez, that looks like a struggle series panel, but I've never seen it. I mean, I studied the catalog resonate and a lot of other things. No image of this. So we went to the people at Christie's, said, tell us about this. I don't know anything about it. Please. He said, well, it had been in Germany for 35 years. Someone from Brooklyn had moved to Germany, and now with the world falling apart in the latter part of 2008, they decided they wanted to sell it. And Peter Nesbitt, who was the head of the Catalog Resonate project of 1998-2000, had just come in the other day to confirm its provenance. This was the real thing, even though there was no image of it. So naturally, I was very interested in it, and it was a funny time where people were worried whether anything would sell, and Christie's went out of their way to call me, massage me, find out whether I was going to bid on it, and so on. But I was fortunate to be able to buy it at that time. And like anything else, you do good things, things come back in a positive way. Do bad stuff, eventually it comes back to haunt you in ways you can never imagine. And the association I developed with Christie's at that time, a year and a half later, developed into some additional panels that came my way. And those 4 panels there were from a private treaty sale I got through Christie's, because they knew about me from a year and a half earlier, and they called me first. But this was 4 of the 5 panels that the distinguished sociologist Kenneth Clark had owned. He was a close friend of Lawrence's, and he died in about 2005, and eventually they tried to sell it privately. I was aware of it. The prices were very high. I passed at the time, and then eventually it came to Christie's, and they called me, and they said, are you interested in 5 panels from the struggles? I said, is that Kenneth Clark's panels? They said, yes. They didn't know that I knew about it, so I'll be right over. And eventually I was able to buy 3 of them. The one that is of Washington being destroyed, you see a little bird there, there's all life in that painting there in the lower right. Battles on Lake Erie and the War of 1812. Woman Mans the Cannon, which is a wonderful focus on women. She was in the Revolutionary War. Her husband died. They were defending, as Americans, the area right near the cloisters. and they eventually lost as Americans had to withdraw from New York, but she was heroic in that moment. A lot of people know about Molly Pitcher, but this woman, Margaret Corbin, was quite heroic. And the fourth one, we couldn't come to terms at the time. Eventually, they sold it to a dealer, and about 4 or 5 years later, I bought it from that dealer at a significant increase, justifiably in price. And so 4 of the 5 I was able to get at that time, and that really changed my attitude from, well, we're continuing one at a time, to realizing that something bigger was going on, that we had developed enough of a critical mass to actually see if we could start looking at these panels from the point of view of scholarship, research. Beth Turner, who had been a curator here for many years, was involved at that point with the idea that maybe we could do the work and reconstruct the series. But it was really at this moment, this focal point in the beginning of 2010, that I realized that something bigger was happening than just collecting paintings.
Well, I know that in the journey along the way, that sometimes one gets away that you hope to have. So
Right.
here's a panel you didn't end up acquiring.
This is a wonderful panel. A dealer who I've been am very close with, and have been for over 20 years. When the catalog Resonate came out in 2000, I went to see them and said, look, of these 25 or so, there are about a dozen I'm really interested in. And the standards I used then and have used throughout are, I wanted panels that were historically important, artistically good, that is aesthetically pleasing, good art, and some are better and some are not as good. And I wanted panels that could stand on their own. Initially in 2000, I might have owned 3 or 4 of them. There was no way for me to imagine that we were going to reconstruct a series. So if you have only 3 or 4, you don't necessarily understand the narrative. There are certain panels I simply would not have bought at that time because on their own, they didn't make sense to me. This one was one of the 12, and the dealer said, oh, good, that's one I think we can get for you, because we sold that to a woman in Connecticut some years ago, and her kids are going to be going to college in a few years, and when she's ready to sell it, we're going to call you first. And okay, 2 or 3 years later, I was speaking with the gallery. They were talking about some painting I might have an interest in. I said, no, I'm a little bit tight for money right now, but if Washington Crossing in Delaware ever came up, I'd figure out a way to finance it. They didn't say anything, but a couple of weeks later, I saw one of the principals of that art dealership at an event, an art event, and while we have a close relationship, we did then and do now, she was a little bit sheepish. She just didn't want to come over to me. Finally, at the end of the event, she did and said, look, I have to tell you, I promised you that if and when Washington Crossing in Delaware comes up, you'd get first crack at it. And it did come up, but the owner said, offer it to an institution before you offer it to a private collector, and the Met bought it. I said, that's wonderful, and I meant it. It's in a great home. I'm very pleased, and good things have come from that. The Met is one of the museums on this tour. They are excited about this exhibition, in part because they have this, and they also have the Lutzer painting, and side by side, this is 12 by 16 inches. That's got 30 feet by who knows what. But the point is, they have a real ownership feeling about this panel and a real affinity for this series, in part because they were fortunate to get this, and I'm very happy it's there.
All right. Well, I think that let's see if we'll just maybe, let's talk about this one. And then maybe we should open it up for some questions, because I know I want to make sure that I know people might have some interesting questions for you, Harvey. But this one was formerly in the collection of our beloved late David Driscoll.
Yes.
So
I knew about that because we had the Struggle series here at the Phillips from the beginning of 2015, February to July or August. And we invited David to give really a keynote on a discussion seminar that we had at the Phillips. And he was quite remarkable, quite amazing, as he always was, talking about this painting and talking about the Struggle series. This painting was in his collection for, I don't know, 40 years. He was a close friend of Jacob Lawrence's, and he talked about the abstract elements in this painting. I don't know much about that kind of thing, but he explained about the lines going in different directions. He really knew what he was talking about. Eventually, I asked him, David, how do you know so much about this painting? He said, Jake told me. Okay? So, you know, for that matter, I've been a trustee of this institution for some years, but a year or two after I became a trustee, David Driscoll also became a trustee, and when he was voted in, the empty seat was right next to me. So he sat next to me. I congratulated him. And he said, geez, I don't know why they want me, you know, an old guy like me to be a trustee. I said, institutional memory. And that's what he had, among so many other things. And so I'm privileged to have bought this through a dealer, not directly to him, because the dealer represented him, and there was no way I was going to go around that dealer in order to get it. I waited for the time when David was ready to sell it, and then through that dealer, I bought it.
Well, and yes, he was such a wonderful, wonderful person. And I do remember that seminar. He was quite brilliant. Mm-hmm. But knowing our time, and also we have a wonderful audience here and also online, I would be remiss to not give them a chance to ask any questions. So we're going to start with anyone here with us, and we have a microphone that we can bring you. If you would love to ask a question, please do so now. And then anyone online, I hope you'll also put any questions in the Q&A, and we'll also take a look at those and do those questions as well. So first, though, let me open it up to our audience with us. Anybody have a question for Harvey? Or a comment?
Don't be afraid.
I think...
Do you have any of Gwendolyn's paintings?
Listen.
Do you have any of
Gwendolyn
Gwendolyn's,
Knight.
his wife's paintings?
No, I met them both in the late 90s, and I think she does some very good work, but I did not.
Again, we can also come back to you all if... Okay, we do have a question over here.
When you started off collecting, did you start off with this theme of socially conscious art, or was that something that developed over time? Why is this the focus of your collection?
I'm having trouble hearing.
Okay, so the question is, when you first started collecting, did you start collecting with the idea that you wanted socially conscious art, or did that evolve over time? Like that idea of a focus, that seems to be quite strong.
That's who Gropper was, and that's who I am. And it was just a natural fit, because I discovered that things that were important to me, there were artistic statements that could reinforce what's inside me. So, you know, it's a little bit like, I remember speaking to a woman who was among the Gentiles the righteous Gentiles who saved Jews during World War II in Holland. And I asked her, I said, it must have been very difficult for you to even think about this. You were so much at risk. And she said, I didn't even give it a second thought. And many people are like that. When they have something inside them that is important, this is who they are. So it was just a natural fit.
We have one question from online. What is the difference for you between looking at a picture you own versus one you don't? For example, one you see in a museum.
Okay, so the question is, what's the difference for you when you look at a picture that you own, like one in your home, one of the ones that you own and live with, versus what it's like for you to look at a picture in a museum?
I don't own anything. I simply have it, at least during my life. And the reason I'm happy to share this is that it's all part of an educational experience. My wife was a teacher for 40 years, and in a sense, she's reaching out beyond the grave to teach younger people. So I just don't see it like that.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, one of the last things I was thinking about is that, to your point about the way that you have such a, you and Harvey-Ann had such a strong educational driven mission in the way you approach art. So what do you hope will come? How are we building on the great momentum of this moment with this exhibition and all the study that's been done? What do you hope for in terms of another chapter and building on the fruits of all that's happened?
Well, Warhol said that, you know, you get 15 minutes of fame. I've gotten 15 months and counting. And I'm sort of a quiet, below the radar type of guy, and that's how I like to be. But because of the tremendous publicity, the awareness nationally, even internationally, that this exhibition, this tour has gotten, I believe it's providing a platform for much more in terms of education with museums, with educational institutions, with scholars, curators, historians, you name it. And so I'm in the process, hopefully with others that are similarly minded, to bring together serious people, necessary funding, a vision of where this can go and how it can be implemented, so that the values that are, the themes that are a part of this series, which are universal, which have been a part of our culture and our challenges throughout our entire history, not just in America, but throughout the world, but particularly with the American experience in mind, that these messages, that these themes are understood, exposed to young people and other people to gain an appreciation and understanding of some of the fundamental issues that we as a country face. Equality or inequality, justice and injustice, all the things that are central to Jacob Lawrence's Struggle series, all the art that I've collected, all the artists that I'm interested in, and frankly myself. So that's what I'd like to happen with all this. We've gotten millions of dollars of free publicity on this exhibition, with or without the panels that were lost suddenly discovering and showing up on front pages throughout the world. And people are going to sit up and take notice. It's not going to end even when we take down the last painting on the wall on September 19th or whatever date it is.
No, that's the date.
You showing up on Sunday?
Well, yeah. So I think that no, we know it's the start of many more good things, and we really appreciate having had you, Harvey, to share your insights. I know there's a lot more, so we'll stay tuned for more to come, and I hope that you all will. Keep watching out for some additional conversations with collectors that Dorothy mentioned. We've got 2 more coming in the fall, and we're just so delighted to have had such a wonderful audience. And really, thank you, Harvey, for making the trip and being with us and being such an amazing steward of the Jacob Lawrence Struggle series. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.